Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to MusicForever, where today I'm bringing you guys a brand new catch-up review, a series of videos where I review some projects released earlier this year that I didn't have a chance to give a full review to when they initially dropped, for one of many reasons. It could be just because it slipped past my radar, it could be because I didn't hear good things about it until after it was released or something like that and I checked it out later on. I will specify specifically when I talk about each of these albums why I didn't review them initially when they came out. But yeah, that's pretty much what this series is for, just covering some albums that I may have missed for whatever reason. I will be trying to make these talks about these albums a bit shorter than my normal reviews, though in past catch-up reviews I've had trouble doing that. So I don't know, maybe I'll just get rid of that aspect of this series and just make them kind of fuller reviews and just have the videos be a bit longer. I don't know. But let's just see how that goes here in this video. And with that said, we're going to be going in order of release in terms of when they came out this year. So, we'll be starting out with the project released earliest this year, the one released longest ago from when I'm, filming this. And we'll be going up to the most recent release. So the order here isn't in order from, like, worst to best or best to worst or anything like that. It's in order of, when they were released. And with that said, let's get started with the first album I want to talk about today, the newest album from JPEGMAFIA, Veteran. This is a project that was released back in January, and initially when it was released, I heard lots of good things about it, and I was interested in checking it out, considering, it got good reviews from people I follow, and it's also in a more experimental alternative hip-hop album, and those subgenres of hip-hop appeal to me the most out of any in the hip-hop, sphere of music. So I was interested in checking this project out, but unfortunately it took me a good while before I actually got around to doing so. But I am happy that I did, because overall I did enjoy this project. Initially, though, this is a project that I enjoyed, but, I wasn't so crazy about, I guess you could say. It took a while to grow on me, pretty much. It kind of reminds me when I was first getting into hardcore punk a few years ago. Initially, it was a genre that I was enjoying aspects of it, though I wasn't crazy about it, but it intrigued me, so I kept coming back to it, and eventually it grew on me a lot more. And that's kind of what happened with this album here. It intrigued me at first, even though I wasn't, crazy about it, but as I kept listening to it and coming back to it, I found more and more things to love with every listen, to the point where, this is one of my favorite albums of the year as of right now. There's a lot of different stuff going on here on this project. And really, if I had to describe JPEGMAFIA's sound across this thing, of course, like I said before, it's more of an experimental hip-hop album with elements of, alternative hip-hop and industrial hip-hop mixed in there as well. But there's also elements of, more poppy or trappier hip-hop thrown in there as well. It's not really all that surprising, in hindsight, that JPEGMAFIA made an appearance on the newest Denzel Curry album, which I also covered in one of these catch-up reviews. Another reason why I decided to check this album out was because I liked his feature on that project, and, Denzel Curry is also another artist who's kind of doing the trappier style of hip-hop, but doing it with a bit more, lyrical substance, I guess you could say, compared to lots of other artists that are doing it. And JPEGMAFIA here, while he's not exactly the same, or the sounding, I guess you could say, as Denzel Curry, he's mixing in those trappier elements into, a more alternative, experimental sound that's just very interesting to hear. JPEGMAFIA on this thing at times kind of reminds me of, like, Drake, but, like, if Drake actually was, like, very good at rapping, like, he reached, like, maybe the full potential that he could have reached, based on, like, his earliest output. Like, he reached his full potential, and then he started going over some really experimental, weird production and having weirder structured songs and all that. That's kind of what this project sounds like at times, because there are moments on this thing, like I said before, where some of those poppier, trappier elements come into play, but they're never really played like a straightforward pop song or anything like that. There will also be moments on this project, like the track Thug Tears, for example, where JPEGMAFIA is doing some singing as well, which, isn't all that far off from what Drake does on his projects, a mix of rapping and singing, though I would say JPEGMAFIA definitely sticks to rapping more on this thing than singing, even though he does occasionally do that as well. I also really like how aggressive and in-your-face this album can be at times, especially with its lyrics. While all the opinions that JPEGMAFIA throws at you on this album are definitely, or at least I'm going to assume, are his own opinions, he kind of exaggerates and, distorts them to the point of being really over the top, really crazy sounding at times. And I really love this very aggressive, style of lyrics, very in-your-face style of lyrics, because it pairs very nicely with, the more aggressive style of instrumentation present on much of this project. And it just creates a very aggressive atmosphere that I think works very nicely. I know some people might be, critical of the lyrics. Some people might think that they're a bit edgy at times, and at first I kind of thought this as well. However, when I really put two and two together, when I realized how nicely it pairs with the very aggressive feel of much of this project and all that, I feel like it just works out pretty well in the end. This album is also littered with tons of great lines and references from JPEGMAFIA, some of which were pretty funny. One of my favorites being on the first track where he references Mike Seatown of Dead End Hip Hop, another YouTube reviewing channel. I thought that was kind of obscure for a reference, even though, it's a more popular YouTube music reviewing channel. I still thought that was pretty cool. I thought it was pretty funny when he said that. One of the more standout lines on this thing, which is saying something considering there's, like I said, there's tons of great lines spread out across all the tracks on this album. And when JPEGMAFIA on this thing decides that he wants to spit, he really can spit. But while at the same time, while he's doing that, he also has a lot of great content to back it up, and also a lot of great instrumentation and production to back it up as well, with many weird and quirky samples thrown in there as well. It's just a very, at times the project can come off a little bit scatterbrained, but kind of in a way where it's supposed to come off that way. It's supposed to be a little bit disorienting. It's supposed to be a little all over the place. Some of the tracks run very short in terms of their runtime. There will be weird samples coming in, rapping, singing. There's all this stuff going on, but when you, kind of take it as a whole, it's a very interesting and very enjoyable listening experience. Like I said, the first times I was going through this album, I was kind of, maybe looking at it more like track by track, and maybe that's why it wasn't clicking with me quite as much, but when I was looking at it more in the context of the whole project, it really all just came together for me, at least. If I was to have any complaints with the project, I would say that towards the middle of the project, it does start to get a little bit, not bad, but a bit, okay-ish, I guess you could say. There's not any bad tracks on this album, I think, and I don't think in the middle there's any bad tracks either. I think that they're all pretty decent songs, but I definitely feel like the beginning and the end of the album, like the first third and last third, were a lot stronger than the middle third, I guess you could say. It was just a point in the album where it got a little bit comfortable, I feel. But still, this is a fantastic project, a fantastic release. If you're a fan of hip-hop, particularly more experimental, alternative hip-hop, I feel like you're really going to like this project because I really can't think of any other artist that sound quite like JPEGMAFIA right now. Like I said, there's plenty of alternative and experimental hip-hop artists out there, but JPEGMAFIA definitely has a unique mix of sounds and styles that no other artist has going for them right now. So you should definitely check this project out. I would highly recommend it. Alright, with that said, next up we're going to be talking about the newest EP from Callison entitled A Picture Perfect Hollywood Heartbreak. This is the debut full-length project from Callison, who you maybe know best as the voice of Steven Universe on the Cartoon Network show of the same name. Now, recently this past summer, I got into Steven Universe. I decided to watch up into the most recent episode, and I ended up loving the show. I think it's a fantastic show overall, and I ended up catching up towards the end of August, or about the middle of August, actually. And, in the process of that, my brothers who were introducing me to the show, because they have already seen the show, they were kind of guiding me through it and all that, they told me not to look up anything relating to the show as to not spoil myself, because that was going to, ruin the experience. So as a result of that, I did not look up anything Steven Universe related at all for the entire watching of my show, really. And as a result of that, I didn't know that this EP came out because obviously, Zach is best known for the voice of Steven Universe. I was avoiding anything Steven Universe related, so I didn't hear about this EP coming out, even though it has nothing to do with Steven Universe itself. I do want to make that clear. This EP, even though it shares, a person involved, it's not a Steven Universe related product by any means, even though I'm guessing a lot of fans of that show are going to be interested in checking this out. But if for whatever reason you haven't seen that show, you could definitely check out this EP. And I highly recommend that you do, actually, considering that this is actually a pretty good project in my opinion. This EP features a wide array of different sounds being incorporated into its overall sound, I guess you could say. There's elements of rock, pop, hip-hop, as well as more theatrical sounding music mixed in here into this final product. If I had to compare the sound of this thing to any other artist out there, it definitely gives me some 21 Pilots vibes at times, as well as maybe like, the theatrical feel of earlier Panic at the Disco as well. Not necessarily that this sounds exactly like either of those two artists, but if I had to compare, I think those maybe are some of the most appropriate comparisons that I could make. But like I said, the sound on this project mixes a lot of different things and ends up sounding fairly unique as a result of that. Like I said, while it's similar to those artists I mentioned before, it's not exactly the same, which I think is a good thing overall. I like how Zach is able to create a pretty unique soundscape for himself, and in the process of taking all these different genres and kind of throwing them together, he's able to create a pretty unique sound for himself, and one that's, at least listening to this project through, I kind of have a sense of what kind of sound he's going for with his music career overall, I guess you could say. And while he mixes a lot of different sounds across this project, it never really comes across as being cluttered or all over the place or anything quite like that. All the songs on this thing still manage to sound relatively focused. And this is also a concept EP as well, which is another thing that I think helps contribute to how focused the overall feel of the project is, because it's not just a collection of songs, thrown together with a bunch of different sounds or anything. While the sounds on this project are pretty diverse, there's a very clear-cut concept to it, and the concept kind of having to do with Zach, or the narrator, whoever that may be, kind of dealing with this breakup with this other person who's also a very popular public figure, I guess you could say, and kind of the fallout that results from this. The narrator here, of course, turns to things like drugs to deal with their own loneliness, things of that sort. They're falling apart, and all that types of stuff pretty much. It's a pretty well executed concept, I would say. It's pretty easy to follow along with it when you're looking at the lyrics. It's not a super vague concept or anything quite like that. It's pretty clear cut, and I do like how Zach is also able to provide some names for some of the characters in this EP as well. It just makes the whole concept a lot more concrete, and I like that he's definitely going for a concept here on this EP. I think, given that he does have, a fame from like a TV show and things like that, it would be pretty easy for him to step into music and probably just, release whatever just because, he can pretty much. So I like the fact that he's clearly going for a specific artistic direction. I feel like he clearly wants to make a definitive statement with his projects, and I like that overall. The opening track to this EP, Phantom Love, is a bit of a slower, more introspective track, kind of reflecting on the breakup that is kind of the catalyst for the entire concept of this EP. Pretty solid opener, gets the concept rolling rather nicely, and with the second full-length track, She Don't Know, we're introduced to a more catchy track, which is something that I relatively enjoy. I like how some of the cuts on this thing, despite all the different sounds going on in the concept and all that, there's still moments on here where Zach's able to provide a pretty catchy hook, which I enjoy. I think that this track and War in particular have some of the catchiest hooks across the entire project. Easy earworms and just pretty fun tracks overall, even if their subject matter at times isn't quite so, happy and catchy, really, because She Don't Know kind of deals with drug addiction as a result of this breakup, a rather dark concept, but it still manages to be a pretty catchy sounding track. Nightmare and Curtain Call are more introspective tracks that I feel like work very nicely in the context of the concept. And then the closing track, War, is probably my favorite on the entire EP. I really like the very over-the-top theatrical feel that it has going for it. I'm just, a sucker for those types of very over-the-top, type things. I just feel like this track executed it very well. And lyrically, it seems kind of like a track that's kind of going at, someone, most like, it's clearly going to be the other person in this breakup. And I like how it's kind of implied almost that this other person is also a musician, and Zach is kind of, or the narrator rather, I'm not sure if it's supposed to be Zach himself, but is kind of going at this person for not quite having the music out there in the world that he now has with this EP, which is a pretty interesting idea overall. It's a very catchy track. I love the over-the-topness of it. I love the different mixing of sounds here. It's a pretty great closer too. It's, like I said, probably my favorite song on the entire EP. Between every full-length song on this project, you get an interlude track, and as a whole, these interludes kind of serve to be more experimental tracks than the more typical songs spread across this project. And like I said, the normal songs on here are pulling from a wide array of sounds, so it's pretty commendable that all these interludes are even a bit more odd and experimental to some degree. Not that any I feel are super out there or difficult to decipher or anything quite like that, but they're pretty interesting, I feel. And it would have been pretty easy to make these just kind of filler to pad out the runtime, but they're not. They add to the concept rather nicely, and they are nice transitions between all the tracks here. I particularly like the final interlude that we get here. It features the voice actress for Connie from the show Steven Universe as well, and it's kind of interesting, the back and forth between Zach and her on this track, because Zach's voice, across this thing and this entire project is deeper than Steven's from the show because, you know, he's older now. His voice isn't quite as high pitched as it was when he started the show. So when he's on the show itself, he's doing a voice for the character, but on this EP, he's doing his normal voice, obviously. But the voice actress for Connie still has her same voice. It's no different, really. So it's just kind of interesting hearing them go back and forth like that, because you know it's the same two characters, but one of them doesn't sound anything like they normally do. And I do want to make it clear, throughout this project, Zach's voice doesn't sound like Steven, but you can kind of at times hear the same sort of inflection in their voices. Like if you're a fan of both, like the series, the show, and this, you'll be able to notice it maybe if you pay attention, but if you're not, you probably won't at all. But still, it was just kind of interesting having that back and forth between the two characters. I thought that was kind of a cool little Easter egg, I guess you can call it. I mean, it's not really hidden or anything, but still, I thought it was kind of cool. And I actually like the content of the interlude as well. It's not just for the feature that I like it, because it's really where the main character here is kind of being faced with all their problems that they've kind of amassed over the previous tracks from when this breakup began, and is being confronted with all of them. And it served as a nice interlude into the final track as well. Overall, a pretty solid transitionary song in here as well, and the others are pretty good as well, I would say, and add a lot of personality to the record. Just a pretty nice selection of interludes, which is something that nowadays isn't too common for records. Oftentimes I feel like lots of interludes and instrumental tracks, things like that, just are there to expand the runtime or things like that. Not really the case with the ones here on this project. As for Zach singing across this project, I would say it's, pretty good. I mean, I expected that, given that I've heard him sing before on Steven Universe, even if it was through a different character's voice. But he sounds very nice here. Like I said, he's able to provide a great hook when he wants to, and he's good at singing the verses as well. But that's, of course, when he's not rapping them, because at several points throughout this thing, Zach decides to rap pretty much, which is something I didn't expect coming into this thing, but overall I think he does a pretty good job with it. I mean, I'm not sure I would say he's on par with, artists like Aesop Rock or MF Doom or something, but, for what I expected from him going into this thing, he's pretty solid overall. Like I said, kind of gave me some 21 Pilots vibes. If you're familiar with that group, it kind of gave me some similar vibes to them with his rapping. Not that it's like exactly the same or anything, and in terms of the subject matter is also pretty different, but I thought his rapping across this thing was pretty solid overall. And I think his lyrics throughout the project are pretty good as well. Like I said, they're all able to convey the story that he's trying to tell in a very, understandable manner. I was never really confused understanding what was going on in this EP. It was all just pretty solid overall. So overall, I would say that this is a very good EP. It's definitely worth checking out if any of the things I just said about it interest you, really. I know, like I said, it's a bit all over the place in terms of all the different sounds it pulls together, but it still manages to sound very coherent as a project. It doesn't sound all over the place when you actually listen to it, even though from the sound it's pulling from, it sounds, on paper like it might end up sounding that way. It's a cohesive project. I like the concept that's going here. I liked all the performances across the project. It's just a very enjoyable thing overall. You don't have to have seen Steven Universe in order to enjoy any of this project, like I said before. So if you, for whatever reason, have not seen that show, which I also recommend you do because it's a great show, but check this EP out as well if it interests you, based on, the way I described it before, because it is very much worth checking out. And I'm very excited to see what Zach might be doing in the future when it comes to future music releases, because, if this is any indication based on this one EP that he's put out so far, I have a feeling that the guy could put out some pretty great music going forward, especially if he keeps up with, concept projects, and if he ever decides to drop like a full-length album. I feel like that could be a pretty exciting thing whenever that ends up happening, if it ever ends up happening. Hopefully it ends up happening someday, because I would greatly appreciate seeing that. But yeah, overall, this is a project that is very much worth checking out. I would highly recommend it. One of my favorite EPs of the year so far. Alright folks, finally we're moving into the last project I'm going to be talking about today in this video, the new album from IDLES, Joy as an Act of Resistance. And this is a project that I initially decided to check out because it got a lot of glowing reviews from lots of people that I follow here on YouTube, so I was like, okay, I want to check this out pretty much. I also heard good things about their last album, Brutalism, released last year. I didn't hear it last year, but I know it made several people I follow's best albums of the year list and things like that, got positive scores from them. So, I was interested in checking this group out, and I figured since they have a new album out, I might as well give it a listen. And overall, I guess this is the point in this video where my opinion might be a bit controversial, because while lots of people I follow seem to be really loving this project, I'm not quite loving this project. Now, don't get me wrong, I like this album. I think it's a pretty good album overall, but I'm not in love with it. There are several problems with it that kind of keep me from being really in love with it. And on my first few listens, this kind of bugged me. I wasn't sure if maybe, the band sound wasn't just clicking with me. So I decided to go back and listen to their first full-length album that was released last year, Brutalism. And I think that's a very good album. I think it's, a pretty great album too. I think that if I had reviewed that album last year at some point, heard it before the end of last year, it might have made my best albums of the year list. So I came back to this album here, the new album that is, and gave it some more listens to see if hearing that old album from them was going to change my mind or anything. And unfortunately, it really didn't. I'm still kind of just okay on this album. Like I said, I don't think it's a bad album, but I don't think it's a fantastic album either. I would say it's just good overall. I'll start by talking about some of the things about this album that I do really enjoy. For starters, I think the album starts off very great with the first track, Colossus, which is just this slower track until towards the end, and I really like how it kind of builds up some tension here. It's a very good opener to the project. I feel it introduces you to the album in a very nice manner. It just gets you invested rather easily. Probably one of my favorites on the entire album. And then it moves into another one of my favorites, Never Fight a Man with a Perm. And it introduces us to one of the bigger concepts running throughout this album, which is just kind of taking down several elements of, kind of toxic masculinity and all that. And on this track, of course, they're kind of making fun of, as kind of is described in the track, kind of this guy who's like, a walking thyroid. He's like all neck. You can kind of imagine who they're talking about in a track like this. And I just really love the sort of takedown going on here in this track. I thought it was really, entertaining. I thought it was kind of funny as well, and it was just portrayed in a very, enjoyable manner, in my opinion. And I do love the concept running throughout this album as a whole in regards to the whole masculinity thing. I think several of the other strongest cuts on this thing also touch upon that same topic. In particular, the track Samaritans, as well as some of the other cuts on here, I feel like cover it in a very solid manner, in my opinion. There's also some tracks on this thing that just manage to be really catchy and enjoyable as a result of that, and, if not that, have at least some sort of pretty quotable, enjoyable line. In terms of the catchy tracks, you have songs like Television and Great that come back to back, both with very catchy, more upbeat sounding choruses, I guess you could say, which is something that kind of, looking back on Brutalism after hearing that album is a bit interesting, considering that album was very dark, very, brutal, I guess you could say. I mean, the album title for that project is not lying. This project here, I mean, you can kind of anticipate that it might be a bit more upbeat, given that, the title of the album is Joy as an Act of Resistance and all that. But the catchiness here wasn't something I was really expecting, looking back on it, in the context of the band's career as a whole. But it was something that I enjoyed overall. It made the tracks a bit more standout, in my opinion. Some other great lines throughout this thing, aside from the ones mentioned before, and the Never Fight a Man with a Perm track. You also have on the track Gramrock, where it's like 10 points for Gryffindor, all that. I thought that was pretty cool overall. There's plenty of other just very quotable, enjoyable lines spread throughout this project, and there were on the first album as well, maybe more on the first album, and that's maybe one of the reasons why I am a little bit more cool on this project in relation to that one. But it's still an enjoyable aspect of this thing. Overall, though, my problems with this thing are, in some degree related to the fact that this isn't as brutal and in-your-face as the previous album. I just prefer the more aggressive, dark, nasty, in-your-face sound that Brutalism had to it compared to this album. I will admit, and that is just a strictly personal, taste sort of thing, I guess you could say. So I could understand why some people might prefer the more upbeat, at times sounding, feel of this project. But there were also just some songs on this project that did not interest me as much, and I just felt like were kind of okay in the grand scheme of things. Like the two tracks that close this thing out, Cry to Me and Rottweiler, not bad songs in their own right. They're pretty okay tracks, but nothing about them really blew my mind or anything. And the fact that they were the two closers kind of ended the album on a weak note, at least in my own opinion. I'm Scum was another one that was, a bit catchier, I feel, than the previous two I mentioned, a bit more standout than those two, but also one of the more forgettable cuts across this thing. One that just kind of didn't really add much to the project, at least in my own opinion. but it's not an awful song by any means either. Like I said, I really don't think there is a bad track across this thing. There's just a few tracks that I feel like are just okay and kind of drag down the rest of the high points that this project decides to give us. The track Danny Nedelko is another one that I kind of have mixed feelings on. The track lyrically deals with the concept of immigration and how, the immigrants aren't bad and all that. I like the lyrics generally on this thing, especially in the verses. I feel like they're pretty well done, and I, like the overall message of the track. However, I just feel like the chorus of the song is just kind of, it kind of falls flat in my opinion. If you don't mind me quoting some of the lyrics here, the chorus goes, "Fear leads to panic, panic leads to pain, pain leads to anger, anger leads to hate." Now, of course, I can understand what the lyrics here are dealing with in the context of the topic of this song. However, it just feels kind of bland in my opinion. Like, I feel like these lyrics could be applied to a lot of the tracks on this album, or their last album, or a lot of political songs in general. Like, it's just a little bit too vague in my opinion to really have the impact that I feel like it's supposed to have. Like, a lot of the tracks on Brutalism and some of the best cuts on this album, the lyrics are so sharp and witty and to the point that they just kind of hit you like a punch to the gut and just stick with you rather easily. However, on a track like this, even though it has a very, interesting concept to the track, there's no other tracks on this album that really are similar to it in terms of the concept. It has an interesting message to it. The verses set it up very nicely, but the hook just kind of falls flat, and as a result, that song ends up being a little bit less memorable than I think it was, intended to be. Though I will say the track is also a bit catchy, which does help to some extent. Once again, not a bad song by any means. It's still a pretty enjoyable track, but it does have some weak elements that kind of hold me back from totally loving it, I guess. So overall, like I said, I think that this is a good album, but I don't think it's a great album. It didn't blow my mind or anything like that, which is kind of disappointing considering I was kind of hoping it would, given some of the praise I've seen it given in the past few weeks or so since it's been released. But overall, like I said, there's some great tracks across this thing, like the opening 2 tracks, as well as a lot of the catchier songs I mentioned before, but there's just some weak moments across this thing that really hold it back from being great. Some more tracks that just don't really add all that much to the project, I feel, that are just a bit more filler-like. Some tracks that the instrumentation isn't quite as interesting. Some tracks where the lyrics are just kind of, fall flat at times maybe, even though I like the overall concept of the song itself. It's kind of an album that, has some very high highs, but some particular low moments really drag it down in my opinion. And overall, I do feel like I still end up preferring Brutalism at the end of the day, at least when it's compared to this project. But yeah, it's not a bad album by any means, though I still do think by saying this I am probably going to anger some people, even though I still think it's a good album overall. But yeah, that's just how I felt about it overall. And with that said, that concludes this newest catch-up review that I've done. Like I said, it's just my own personal opinion concerning these 3 projects. If you happen to disagree, if you happen to love one that I didn't like all that much, if you happen to hate one that I loved, it's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave a comment in the comment section down below concerning your own opinions and thoughts on these projects. I greatly appreciate seeing them. And while you're down there, make sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content, things like album reviews, countdown lists, discussion videos, track reviews, all that kinds of stuff. So if you enjoy that, make sure you subscribe. And with that said, thank you guys for watching this catch-up review, and stay golden.